The streets of New Cascadia hummed with life, a chaotic blend of human and alien voices mixing together under the glow of neon signs. Hovercrafts drifted overhead, their low hum barely noticeable beneath the noise of the bustling city. Among the sea of bodies moving through the crowded market, Raylan Voss stood with his arms crossed, a deep sigh escaping his lips. Facing him was an alien woman who looked as though she had been carved from dusk itself. Her violet skin shimmered faintly under the city lights, her elongated ears twitching in irritation. Gold-flecked eyes glared at him with a mix of frustration and something dangerously close to desperation. A deep purple tail lashed behind her, betraying the emotions she refused to voice. Raylan had dealt with a lot of stubborn people in his life. Mercenaries who wouldn't take a job unless the price was right, traders who'd rather die than admit they'd been scammed, but none of them compared to the sheer level of determination standing in front of him now. "You don't seem to understand the concept of..." "No," he said, his tone edged with exhaustion. The alien's chin lifted, her expression utterly unyielding. "You saved my life. I am bound to you now." Raylan scrubbed a hand down his face. "Oh, for the love of, look, I didn't save you. I just saw a couple of thugs getting rough with you in an alley and decided to step in. That doesn't mean you owe me some kind of life debt." She took a sharp step forward, her presence oddly imposing despite her lean frame. "Among my people, a life debt is sacred. You may not understand its importance, but I will not disgrace myself by walking away from it." Raylan exhaled, trying to rein in the growing frustration bubbling beneath his skin. "Okay, let's say I humor you. What exactly does this debt entail?" "I serve you until my honor is repaid." Raylan stared at her, waiting for some kind of clarification. When none came, he let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Oh, so what? You're gonna follow me around, clean my house, fetch me coffee? That's not how things work here, lady." Her brows furrowed. "You mock me. I mock the fact that you're taking something simple and making it unnecessarily complicated." Her expression remained unreadable, though the sharp flick of her tail betrayed her irritation. "What do you require of me?" Raylan pinched the bridge of his nose. "Listen, I don't want anything from you. I don't need a personal servant or a bodyguard or whatever it is you think you're supposed to be. Just go live your life." She stiffened at that. "I cannot. I am honor-bound." "For how long?" Silence. Raylan narrowed his eyes. "Anira Va." Her name rolled off his tongue in a way that surprised even him. She blinked, as if startled by the sound of it coming from a human mouth. But instead of softening, she held her ground. "The length of service depends on the depth of the debt." Raylan crossed his arms. "And how deep is this one?" She hesitated. A bad sign. Finally, she spoke. "A life for a life." Raylan let out a strangled groan. "You've got to be kidding me." Anira Va remained stoic, unwavering in the face of his exasperation. "It is the way of my people." "Well, your people's way is insane." Her golden eyes flashed with warning, but Raylan was too irritated to care. This had to be some kind of joke. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, stepped in to stop a mugging, and now he was stuck with an alien noblewoman breathing down his neck for the rest of his life? Absolutely not. "Nope, not happening. You don't owe me anything. You're free to go." Her nostrils flared, frustration leaking into her expression for the first time. "You do not understand. Walking away from this would shame my family. I cannot return home knowing I have left a debt unpaid." Raylan stared at her, searching for some kind of loophole in this ridiculous situation. "You're seriously telling me that you'd rather uproot your entire life and follow me around forever instead of just letting it go?" Anira Va's gaze was firm. "Yes." Raylan let out a slow breath, tilting his head toward the sky as if searching for patience among the stars. He had a feeling this was going to be a nightmare. Still, the stubborn set of her jaw told him that no amount of arguing would change her mind. He could walk away now, but something told him she'd just show up at his shop the next morning, waiting. She was nothing if not persistent. An idea began forming in the back of his mind, reckless and probably stupid, but at least it would keep him from having to deal with her hovering over him like some kind of celestial watchdog. "Fine," he said finally. You want to stick around? Then let's make a deal. Aniravie's ears perked slightly. A deal? You said you're bound to me, right? That means I get a say in how this goes. She hesitated, then gave a slow nod. All right, Raylan said, crossing his arms. You can stay, but not as some kind of servile debt-bound warrior. If you're going to be here, you're going to learn how to live like a human. Aniravie's expression flickered with something. Uncertainty, perhaps? He wasn't sure. Live like a human? She repeated slowly. Yep. No honor-bound servitude, no weird warrior customs, no treating me like some kind of sacred charge. You're going to get a normal job, make friends, figure out what you actually want out of life instead of just following some outdated tradition. For the first time since their conversation started, she looked genuinely uncertain. She trailed off, her tail flicking slightly. I have never lived outside the expectations of my people. Raylan sighed, softening just a fraction. Then maybe it's time to start. Aniravie studied him for a long moment, and Raylan had the distinct feeling she was weighing his very soul with that golden gaze. Finally, she gave a slow, reluctant nod. Very well, she said. I will learn. Raylan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Great. But don't say I didn't warn you. Human life isn't exactly what you're used to. Aniravie's lips quirked slightly, as if in amusement. And you, Raylan Voss, are not what I am used to either. Raylan wasn't sure why, but something about the way she said his name sent a strange warmth curling through his chest. Shaking off the feeling, he nodded toward the neon-lit street behind him. Come on, then. If you're going to do this, we better start now. Aniravie hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, falling into stride beside him. As they walked into the city, Raylan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a decision that would change everything. The sun dipped low over New Cascadia, casting long shadows across the towering buildings and bustling streets. Raylan led Aniravie through the heart of the city, dodging between groups of pedestrians and the occasional street vendor shouting about discounted wares. The air smelled of spices, engine grease, and the faint metallic tang of ozone from the hovercrafts overhead. Despite himself, he kept glancing sideways at Aniravie. She walked with a warrior's grace, every step calculated and precise, as if ready for an ambush at any moment. Her golden eyes flicked across the environment, analyzing every little movement, every sound. You don't have to walk like you're expecting a fight, Raylan muttered, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. She shot him a look. One should always be prepared for battle. Yeah, well, unless you plan on throwing down with a street performer or a food vendor. I think you can relax. She frowned but made an effort to loosen her stance, though it was a small, almost imperceptible change. They passed a noodle stand where an elderly vendor ladled out steaming bowls of broth to a group of off-world tourists. The scent was tempting, and Raylan realized with a start that he hadn't eaten since early that morning. Ever had human food? He asked on a whim. Aniravie's nose crinkled slightly. I have had rations. Raylan snorted. Yeah, that doesn't count. Come on. He stepped up to the stand, exchanging a few credits for 2 bowls of fragrant, steaming noodles. Aniravie hesitated before accepting hers, eyeing it with suspicion. You eat it, Raylan said, demonstrating by lifting a portion of the noodles with his chopsticks. Aniravie mimicked his movement, though with considerably more precision, he noted, before taking a tentative bite. The moment the broth hit her tongue, her pupils dilated slightly, and she went still. Raylan smirked. Told you it's good. She swallowed and regarded him with something bordering on reluctant appreciation. It is acceptable. He barked a laugh. That's the highest praise I've ever heard from someone who looked like they were about to stab their dinner. Aniravie arched a brow but said nothing, taking another careful bite. They ate in companionable silence for a while, watching the crowds pass by. Raylan found himself oddly at ease, despite the bizarre circumstances of their new arrangement. After finishing their meal, they continued through the city, eventually arriving at Raylan's shop, a modest but well-kept mechanic's garage wedged between 2 larger buildings. The neon sign overhead flickered slightly, displaying Voss Repairs in bright blue letters. Anirva stopped at the entrance, her gaze sweeping over the shop's interior. Half-assembled hovercraft engines, shelves stacked with old tech, the distinct scent of oil and metal lingering in the air. "You work here?" she asked, sounding almost perplexed. Raylan raised a brow. "What? Expecting something grander?" She tilted her head, considering. "I assumed a man who so boldly interferes in a fight would have a different profession." "Like what?" "A soldier." Raylan snorted. "Yeah, no thanks. Been there, done that, didn't exactly enjoy the experience." Her expression shifted, her gaze lingering on him a moment longer. "Then why did you intervene?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I don't like seeing people get kicked around by scumbags. Simple as that." Anirva studied him, something unreadable flickering behind her golden eyes. "You are an unusual man, Raylan Voss. So I've been told." She glanced back at the shop. "And what is my role here?" Raylan smirked. "That depends. How are you with engines?" She blinked. "I have piloted warships, if that is what you mean." Raylan let out a low whistle. "All right, well, let's start small. I'll show you the ropes, and if you don't set anything on fire, maybe I'll even let you fix something." Anirva gave him a look that was somewhere between insulted and amused. "I do not set things on fire." "Yeah? We'll see about that." And just like that, the next phase of their strange arrangement began. Over the next several days, Raylan quickly learned a few key things about Anirva. First, she was insanely disciplined. She woke at dawn, maintained her weapons with near-religious dedication, and treated even the smallest tasks with the same level of seriousness one might expect from a soldier on a battlefield. Second, she had no concept of personal space. Whether it was lingering a little too close when he explained how to fix an engine or standing silently behind him while he worked, she was always just there, watching, observing. It was unnerving at first, but he was slowly getting used to it. And third, she was stubborn as hell. "Turn it counterclockwise," Raylan said, leaning over the exposed hover engine. "I am turning it counterclockwise," Anirva shot back, her hands gripping a wrench as she worked at the rusted bolt. Raylan crossed his arms. "You're turning it clockwise." Her ears twitched, and she scowled. "No, I am." She stopped mid-sentence as the bolt finally loosened, after turning it the other direction. Raylan smirked. "Told you." Anirva set the wrench down with far more force than necessary, glaring at him. "Your machinery is illogical." "Nah, you just don't like being wrong." Her tail flicked sharply, but she said nothing. Despite the bickering, she was a quick learner. Within days, she could disassemble an engine with impressive speed, though she still struggled with the more delicate work. Raylan had to admit it was nice having someone around. He hadn't realized just how quiet the shop had been before. One evening, after locking up for the night, they sat outside on the shop's small rooftop balcony. The city stretched out before them, neon lights flickering in the distance. "You are different from the humans I have encountered before," Anirva said suddenly. Raylan glanced at her. "Yeah? How so?" She was silent for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "Most see my kind as outsiders. Threats. You do not seem to care." He shrugged. "I don't judge people by what they are. I judge them by what they do." Anirva turned her gaze to the sky. A simple philosophy, but effective. She was quiet after that, watching the stars with an expression Raylan couldn't quite place. For the first time since she arrived, she looked almost at peace. And somehow that unsettled him more than anything else. Raylan had always considered himself a patient man. Years of working as a mechanic, dealing with uncooperative machinery, impossible deadlines, and the occasional clueless customer, had taught him to keep his temper in check. But Anirva was testing limits he hadn't even realized he had. It wasn't just her stubbornness, though that was bad enough. It wasn't even her tendency to argue with him over everything, from the best way to tighten a bolt to whether or not human music was worth listening to. No, what truly pushed him to the edge was her absolute refusal to accept help. Raylan had noticed it early on. If she struggled with a task, she would work at it in silence, refusing assistance. If she was injured, she'd pretend it didn't exist, even when she was obviously in pain. If she didn't understand something, she would act as if she did, only to make things harder for herself in the long run. First, he'd found it frustrating. Then it became infuriating. Tonight was the final straw. It started with a simple repair job. A client had brought in a personal transport bike, its propulsion system fried from an overheating issue. It should have been a routine fix, but Anira VA, determined as always to prove she could handle human technology, had insisted on repairing it herself. Raylan had warned her that the power core needed to be discharged before handling the internal wiring. She had nodded, had even repeated the instructions back to him. And yet, 30 minutes later, there was a loud pop, followed by a yelp of pain. Raylan spun around just in time to see Anira VA stagger back from the transport bike, clutching her left hand. Wisps of smoke curled from the exposed wiring, and the scent of burnt metal filled the air. "Are you kidding me?" Raylan was at her side in seconds, grabbing her wrist before she could pull away. His eyes narrowed at the angry red burn that now marred her dark skin. "You didn't discharge it, did you?" She clenched her jaw, her ears flattening slightly. "It was a miscalculation." Raylan exhaled sharply through his nose. "A miscalculation?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "You knew this could happen. I told you this would happen. It is not serious." She tried to pull her hand back, but Raylan tightened his grip. "Oh, not serious? So you're telling me this?" He gestured at her burned hand. "Doesn't hurt?" Anira VA's golden eyes flickered, but she squared her shoulders. "Pain is temporary. I can endure it." Raylan snapped. He released her wrist so suddenly that she almost lost her balance. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing away from her before turning back with fire in his eyes. "Endure it? That's your answer?" His voice rose, frustration spilling over. "You think that makes you strong? Just toughing it out, pretending nothing's wrong?" Anira VA stiffened. "I do not pretend." "Bullshit." Raylan's voice cracked like a whip, and she flinched. "You're always doing this. Always acting like you don't need help. Like letting someone give a damn about you is some kind of weakness." Her tail lashed once, her jaw tightening. "Because it is a weakness." Raylan let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, for the love of, no, it's not. You know what is weak? Being too damn proud to accept help when you need it. You think pushing everyone away makes you stronger? It just makes you alone." Silence stretched between them. The air was thick, charged. Anira VA's fingers twitched at her side, but her face remained blank, carefully controlled. "I am accustomed to being alone." Raylan's chest tightened at the quiet admission. He took a slow breath, failing to cool his anger. "Well, maybe that's your problem," he muttered. He turned sharply on his heel, grabbing the first aid kit from the shelf. Without another word, he sat down on the nearby workbench and held out his hand. "Sit." Anira VA hesitated. Raylan lifted a brow. "You can sit, can't you?" Her tail flicked again, but she finally relented, perching stiffly on the stool across from him. He reached for her injured hand, half expecting her to pull away. She didn't, though she remained tense. Raylan worked in silence, gently applying an antiseptic cream before wrapping the burn in gauze. His movements were careful, precise, far gentler than she had likely expected from him. Anira VA watched him closely, her golden eyes searching his face. "You are angry." Raylan didn't look up. "No kidding." A pause. Then softly, "Why?" Raylan's hands stilled for a fraction of a second before he resumed wrapping the bandage. "Because I care," he muttered. "And you keep acting like that's a bad thing." Anira VA's lips parted slightly. Whatever she had expected him to say, that wasn't it. Raylan finally met her gaze, his own eyes tired but unwavering. "You don't have to do everything alone, Anira. I don't know what kind of life you've had before this, but I'm not your enemy. I'm not going to disappear the second you let your guard down." She stared at him, something unspoken flickering behind her eyes. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she relaxed. "I will try," she murmured. Raylan huffed, shaking his head as he tied off the bandage. "That's all I ask." The shop was quiet, save for the hum of distant city noise. For the first time since she arrived, Anira VA wasn't trying to prove anything, wasn't keeping up her walls. She was just there, present in the moment. Raylan let out a breath and gave her hand a final squeeze before releasing it. There. Try not to set yourself on fire again. A small, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. I will make a strong effort. Raylan snorted, shaking his head. Yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. But beneath the teasing, something had shifted between them. A fragile understanding. And for the first time, Raylan had the feeling that maybe, just maybe, Anira VA was finally starting to trust him. The following days passed with a quiet shift in the air between them. Anira VA no longer rejected his help outright, though she still hesitated, as if every moment of trust was a battle she waged within herself. Raylan didn't push, he simply made himself available, letting her come to terms with it on her own. She still argued with him, of course. That would probably never change. She still challenged him over everything from tool placement to his outrageous love for coffee. But something about her gaze had softened, like she no longer saw him as someone to keep at arm's length. One evening, as Raylan locked up the shop, he found her standing outside, staring up at the sky. The city lights dulled the stars, but a few shone through, distant but persistent. He stepped beside her, stuffing his hands into his pockets. You thinking about heading back to your people? Anira VA didn't answer right away. Instead, she let out a slow breath. Once, that was all I thought about. Raylan studied her, noting the way her tail curled loosely instead of its usual sharp, defensive flicks. And now, she turned to him, her golden eyes reflecting the faint city glow. Now, I wonder what it is that truly makes a place home. Raylan swallowed, caught off guard by the weight of the words. Anira VA had never spoken much about where she came from. He only knew the basics, that her people were warriors, raised to be self-reliant, to see attachment as a weakness. The idea of home, for her, had likely never been about warmth or comfort. It had been about duty, about survival. But now, as she looked at him, something unreadable in her expression. Raylan had the distinct feeling she was standing at a crossroads. Home's not just a place, he said after a moment. It's people. Her gaze lingered on him, unblinking. Then, to his absolute shock, she took a step closer. Raylan barely had time to process it before she reached out, pressing her forehead lightly against his. It wasn't human. Not a kiss or an embrace, but something instinct told him meant just as much. His breath caught, heart pounding at the sudden closeness. She was warm, her presence steady despite the hesitation he could feel in her grip as her fingers curled against his sleeve. You are the most infuriating human I have ever met, she murmured, the words soft, almost teasing. Raylan smirked, his own voice quiet. And you're the most stubborn alien I've ever had to deal with. Anira VA huffed, but she didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned just a fraction closer. For a long time, they simply stood there, the world around them fading into the background. Raylan didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if Anira VA would stay, or if she would wake up tomorrow and decide this had all been a mistake. But at that moment, with her warmth against his and the quiet weight of understanding between them, he knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he.